March 1945. A cold morning settles over a small German town near the Rhine. The war has already passed through, leaving broken roofs, empty streets, and a silence that feels heavier than the shelling that came before it. Children stand in doorways, thin coats pulled tight, watching unfamiliar soldiers move cautiously between damaged houses. Their helmets are different. Their language is strange. Their trucks carry white stars instead of black crosses. For years, these children were told to fear this moment. They were warned that enemy soldiers would bring punishment, hunger, and revenge. Yet what they see does not match the stories. American infantrymen stop at the edge of the street. One kneels to eye level. Another unloads crates, not ammunition but food. Canned meat, bread, powdered milk. Inside nearby homes, families wait in silence, unsure whether to hide or step forward. Outside, children watch their parents' faces change, from fear to confusion to disbelief. The war is not over, but something has shifted, and that shift begins not with orders or speeches, but with a simple, unexpected act of help. An act that will quietly reshape how an entire generation remembers the end of the war. By early 1945, Germany was no longer a nation at war in the conventional sense. It was a country in physical and social breakdown. Allied bombing had destroyed much of its industrial base, transportation networks were fractured, and entire cities lay in ruins. For civilians, especially children, the war had become a daily struggle for survival rather than ideology or victory. Food shortages defined life. By late 1944, official rations for German civilians had fallen well below subsistence levels. In many regions, children received fewer than 1,000 calories a day. Protein was scarce. Fresh milk was almost non-existent. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly among the young and the elderly. Schools closed intermittently, not because of fighting, but because there was no heat, no food, and no staff left to teach. As the Western Front moved steadily eastward, millions of civilians were displaced. Families fled advancing armies with what they could carry. Children slept in cellars, barns, or bombed-out stations. Air raid sirens had shaped their sense of time for years, and the sound of aircraft, once distant, now meant imminent danger. Many had lost fathers, brothers, or older sisters to the front, to bombing raids, or to forced evacuations. Equally powerful was the psychological environment. Nazi propaganda had spent years shaping how German civilians, especially children, viewed the enemy. Americans, in particular, were portrayed as violent, undisciplined, and cruel. Posters, school lessons, and radio broadcasts warned that Allied soldiers would loot homes, harm women, and starve children. These images were not abstract. They were taught deliberately, reinforced repeatedly, and rarely questioned in a tightly controlled information system. By the winter of 1944 to 45, belief and fear merged. As American units crossed into German territory following the Battle of the Bulge and the collapse of the Siegfried Line, entire towns prepared for the worst. Families hid what little they owned. Mothers warned children not to speak, not to look, not to approach. In many homes, children were told that silence and obedience might keep them alive. Yet the advance was not chaotic. Behind the armored spearheads and infantry divisions was an occupation doctrine shaped by years of planning. The Allies understood that Germany's collapse would place millions of civilians, many of them children, directly under military control. How those civilians were treated would matter long after the last shots were fired. That understanding would soon collide with the reality German families expected, and the contrast would define the first days of contact. For German children, the arrival of American soldiers was not a single event but a series of moments. Small, tense encounters that unfolded slowly over days. They watched from behind doorframes and broken fences, absorbing details their parents could not afford to notice. The color of uniforms, the unfamiliar shape of helmets, the sound of boots on stone streets. These sensory fragments carried more weight than any slogan they had been taught. Most children had been raised in an environment of strict obedience and constant warning. They had learned not to ask questions, not to approach strangers, and not to trust what they saw. When American soldiers appeared, The instinct was not curiosity, but caution. Yet children are observers by nature. They noticed when soldiers avoided private homes. They noticed when guards waved civilians through checkpoints rather than shouting. These details unsettled expectations. From the American side, children posed a different challenge. Soldiers had been warned about sabotage and hidden weapons, even among civilians. Yet the reality in front of them was unmistakable. Thin faces, worn shoes, hands that reached not for stones or tools, but for food. Many soldiers had siblings at home the same age. That recognition did not erase discipline, but it softened reactions. Orders shaped behavior. Soldiers were instructed to keep distance, avoid favoritism, and maintain authority. But they were also told to prevent civilian suffering when possible. This balance played out in everyday choices, whether to share rations, whether to call a medic, whether to allow children to gather near trucks distributing supplies. German parents watched closely. They measured safety not by words, but by patterns. When no reprisals came, when houses were not searched without reason, when children returned home unharmed after brief encounters. Slowly, fear loosened its grip, replaced by cautious calculation. These early interactions did not end the war for children. Hunger remained. Homes were still damaged. But they introduced something new, a gap between what had been promised by years of propaganda and what was unfolding in reality. That gap would widen as American presence became more organized, and as help shifted from isolated gestures to structured action. As the American occupation of Western Germany settled into routine, the treatment of civilians, especially children, became less dependent on individual decisions and more shaped by logistics and policy. This transition marked a critical shift. What had begun as cautious, improvised interactions developed into organized systems of relief, supervision, and control. Food distribution centers were established in towns and villages once active fighting ended. These were not charitable operations in the traditional sense. They were military necessities. Starving populations bred disease, unrest, and instability. American civil affairs units coordinated with medical officers to identify the most vulnerable children, pregnant women, and the elderly. Supplementary rations, including powdered milk and vitamin-enriched foods, were prioritized for them. In many areas, these supplements represented the first reliable nutrition children had received in months. For German families, the moral contradiction was striking. The same nation portrayed as brutal and indifferent was now enforcing hygiene, regulating rations, and reopening schools where possible. Children were instructed to line up, wash their hands, and attend basic health checks. These measures were practical, not sentimental, but their impact was deeply emotional. Order replaced chaos. Predictability replaced fear. From the American perspective, restraint was intentional. Commanders understood that visible discipline mattered. Soldiers who mistreated civilians undermined long-term objectives. Military police enforced curfews and rules uniformly. The message was clear. Authority would be firm but not arbitrary. This consistency mattered most to children, who quickly learned patterns of safety and danger. The psychological effect on German children was profound. The enemy no longer existed as an abstract threat. He had a face, a routine, and limits. Children began to test boundaries, approaching aid stations, observing drills, listening to unfamiliar accents. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. What collapsed most decisively was the image built by years of propaganda. The contrast between expectation and experience created confusion, then reassessment. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why were these soldiers helping? Why was no punishment coming? These questions marked the beginning of a deeper turning point, one that would emerge fully when aid, authority, and trust intersected under extraordinary conditions. The decisive moment did not arrive with a single announcement or ceremony. It emerged gradually, through repetition, consistency, and exposure. By late March and April 1945, in many towns across Western Germany, American soldiers were no longer passing through. They were staying. And for children, permanence changed everything. The first true turning point came when emergency aid became routine. Trucks arrived on schedules. Distribution points opened at the same hours each day. Medical officers returned regularly, not once. Children who had learned to ration every movement began to anticipate tomorrow. That anticipation, small as it was, signaled a break from survival thinking shaped by years of war. One of the most significant shifts occurred in family behavior. Parents who had initially hidden their children indoors now allowed them to accompany them to aid stations. This decision was not made lightly. It reflected an assessment that the risk of starvation outweighed the fear of contact. When children returned unharmed, carrying food or medicine, the calculation changed again. American soldiers noticed this shift. Guards who once saw only shuttered windows now watched children gather at street corners. Some units reported that children appeared earlier each morning, waiting quietly rather than begging. Discipline held. Soldiers did not chase them away. Authority remained, but hostility did not. Medical intervention marked another critical moment. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and exhaustion had weakened many children beyond what families could manage. U.S. Army medics examined children systematically, documenting weight loss, illness, and recovery. These records, dry and clinical, captured a humanitarian crisis in numerical terms. But for families, the experience was personal. Children who had been fading began to stabilize. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time in years, parents saw their children gain strength rather than lose it. This improvement was not symbolic. It was measurable, and it was tied directly to the presence of the occupying force they had been taught to fear. Trust did not arrive suddenly, but disbelief began to erode. The enemy image fractured under the weight of consistent, verifiable behavior. For children especially, memory formed quickly around experience rather than ideology. That erosion of fear would accelerate as American involvement expanded beyond emergency relief into daily civilian life. By May 1945, Germany's surrender formalized what many civilians had already sensed. The war, at least in their towns, was over. For children, this realization did not come through radio announcements or documents. It arrived through stability, through days without gunfire, through meals that arrived on time, through the absence of punishment they had been warned would come. American military governance expanded rapidly in the weeks following surrender. Schools, when buildings remained usable, were cautiously reopened under supervision. Teachers were screened, curricula stripped of Nazi ideology, and basic instruction resumed. For children, returning to structured learning, even in damaged classrooms, signaled a return to something recognizable. The presence of armed foreign soldiers outside those schools no longer meant danger. It meant protection. Food programs became more targeted. In many areas, American authorities approved supplemental feeding specifically for children, recognizing that years of malnutrition could not be reversed through standard rations alone. Milk kitchens were established. Calorie intake was monitored. These efforts were not acts of mercy in isolation. They were part of a broader strategy to prevent long-term social collapse. But to families, intention mattered less than outcome. The most decisive emotional turning point came through repetition. Day after day, nothing bad happened. Homes were not taken. Children were not harmed. Mothers were not punished for approaching soldiers. This consistency dismantled fear more effectively than words ever could. German children adapted quickly. They learned which uniforms meant authority, which gestures signaled permission, which spaces were safe. American soldiers, too, adjusted. Many had entered Germany expecting hostility. Instead, they encountered exhaustion and need. The distance between victor and defeated narrowed in subtle ways, through regulated contact, shared routines, and the mutual understanding that the fighting was finished. By early summer, something irreversible had occurred. For German children in occupied zones, the enemy was no longer a monster defined by stories. He was a presence governed by rules, predictable and restrained. The shock was not that Americans were kind. It was that the fear had been wrong, and that realization would shape not only the immediate recovery, but the memory of the war itself. The end of combat did not mark the end of suffering. Germany in mid-1945 remained a country in crisis. Infrastructure was shattered, housing scarce, and millions of civilians displaced. Yet, in the American-occupied zones, conditions began to stabilize more quickly than many had expected. For children and their families, this stability was not abstract. It was visible in daily survival. Food remained the central issue. Allied reports from the summer of 1945 confirmed that German civilian rations were still dangerously low, particularly in urban areas. However, targeted interventions made a measurable difference. Supplementary feeding programs for children reduced the worst effects of starvation. Weight gain, though slow, was documented in medical reports. Childhood mortality, while still elevated, declined in areas where aid was consistent. Public health measures followed. American authorities prioritized sanitation, vaccination, and disease control, fearing outbreaks of typhus and tuberculosis. Children were screened, isolated when necessary, and treated in military-run facilities when civilian hospitals could not function. These efforts prevented large-scale epidemics at a time when Germany was most vulnerable. Psychologically, the impact was equally significant. Children who had lived under constant alarm learned new routines. Curfews replaced air raid sirens. Lines replaced chaos. Authority, though foreign, became predictable. For families, predictability restored a sense of control. Parents could plan, even if only one day at a time. The American presence also reshaped civilian behavior. Black markets remained, but violence declined. Looting was curtailed through enforcement rather than terror. Disputes were mediated by military courts rather than local party officials. For children, this shift meant fewer sudden disruptions and less arbitrary punishment. None of this erased trauma. Many children remained deeply affected by loss, displacement, and hunger. But the immediate post-war months introduced a crucial difference. Recovery became possible. Survival no longer depended solely on luck or concealment. That possibility would influence not just individual families, but the broader direction of post-war German society as occupation turned into reconstruction. As months turned into years, the experiences of German children in the American occupation zones became part of a larger transformation. The immediate crisis of survival gradually gave way to reconstruction, education, and reorientation. For those who had lived through the war as children, early encounters with American soldiers left impressions that extended far beyond 1945. Education was one of the most significant long-term factors. Schools reopened under Allied supervision emphasized civic responsibility, basic democratic principles, and the rejection of racial ideology. For children who had been exposed to propaganda from an early age, this shift created a clear divide between what they had been taught and what they now experienced. The presence of American authority in this process gave those lessons credibility, reinforced by the memory of tangible help rather than abstract instruction. Economic recovery also played a role. As food supplies stabilized and housing slowly improved, families were able to rebuild routines. Children returned to structured childhoods, school, work, play, rather than constant displacement. This normalization mattered. It anchored memory not in chaos, but in gradual improvement associated with the post-war period. Historians and sociologists studying post-war Germany have noted that children who experienced humane treatment during occupation were more receptive to reconciliation and reform later in life. This was not universal, and it did not erase national trauma. But it created a foundation upon which trust could be rebuilt. For many, American soldiers became linked not only to defeat, but to survival. The memory of those early months remained complex. Occupation was still occupation. Authority was still imposed. But the absence of widespread abuse and the presence of structured aid challenged simplified narratives of vengeance or cruelty. Children carried these contradictions into adulthood, shaping how they understood both the war and its end. By the time Germany began its formal political reorganization, an entire generation had already internalized a critical lesson. The enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of restraint, order, and responsibility. That realization would resonate quietly through post-war society, influencing attitudes long after the uniforms disappeared from the streets. For German children who lived through the final months of the Second World War, the end of the conflict was not defined by victory or defeat. It was defined by transition. by the slow movement from fear to uncertainty, and from uncertainty to cautious stability. Their memories were shaped not by speeches or treaties, but by daily encounters, by whether food arrived, whether illness was treated, and whether those in power exercised restraint. History often records wars through battles, leaders, and dates. But for children, war is experienced differently. It is felt in empty kitchens, in nights spent listening for danger, in the sudden appearance of strangers who carry authority over survival. In occupied Germany, American soldiers represented all of those things at once. They were the face of defeat. They were also the agents of order. The shock these children felt was not rooted in kindness alone. It came from contradiction. The reality they encountered did not align with the world they had been prepared to expect. That dissonance forced a reassessment not of politics but of people. It replaced certainty with observation, and fear with evidence. This experience did not absolve the destruction of the war, nor did it erase responsibility for its causes. But it shaped how a generation understood its aftermath. The end of violence, the return of routine, and the presence of predictable authority allowed recovery to begin where collapse had seemed inevitable. In the quiet spaces after history's loudest moments, it is often these human experiences that endure longest. For many German children, the memory of the war's end was not marked by the sound of guns falling silent, but by the realization that survival and even rebuilding could begin under circumstances they had been taught to fear. Their story remains a reminder that how wars end can matter as much as how they are fought.